the lockdown started on March the 23rd in 2020, and I suppose it was very frightening and so much anxiety, and very quickly the statistics started getting made us very fearful, and it made me not want to paint the way I normally did, which is more freely. I sort of pulled myself in and started working on playing cards because they, in a way, were liberating. I thought they were a very good metaphor for the sort of chance or lottery nature of what was going on. I also felt increasingly monastic. Things became very systematic, repeated, sort of Groundhog Day feeling. I began to realise that actually what I was making was actually about COVID. I didn't realise it initially because I didn't think we'd been in it for very long. I began to realise I was making what was an equivalent book of hours, which is in reference to the books that were created for devotional Christian devotions to the lay people, and it was a way to instruct them and guide them through their daily, weekly and monthly and seasonal devotions to their faith. And I felt this was beginning to become a devotion to the pandemic, to COVID. The gilding, which is on each page, is a sort of reference to the original Book of Hours that would have been painted by the illuminations that would have been painted by the monks. All the work that I did for these books, all these cards, all these images, I did them here in my studio in this little rural part of coastal Suffolk, not so far from the sea. And butterflies represent frailty. They have very short lives. So I put them with candles here because, again, they are this measure that you see in paintings, a lot in sort of northwest European histories, of the shortness of life, the fragility. So they seem to be a very good metaphor for what was going on. So here, the page becomes more blue, and there you see again the theme of the butterflies. But also, at the time in May, there was this glorious bluebell season. And the other plant that we have in such abundance into the middle of June is fantastic forget-me-nots. And of course, again, the name is so relevant at this particular point. This page is about the different birds. We have birds of prey, and thinking about the freedoms that they have, that they can migrate. They don't have any of these boundaries that were set up and the restrictions that we were all under. One of the most explosive political events of the first lockdown was the reaction to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis towards the end of May in 2020. It was a sort of incendiary moment when all the issues about Black Lives Matter came to a real sort of head. Also, there was so much loss, tragedy going on, and people couldn't connect with each other. Terrible stories of people having to die alone, and, just a lot of awfulness. And all these care workers working themselves day and night, and it just became mesmerising and bewildering and beyond any sort of comprehension. So that was the global deaths then. But actually what was happening in Britain was that the numbers were going down and things were lightening up and restrictions were easing, and we'd come out of this and the summer seemed to suddenly have a new buoyancy and optimism. And so I thought, in my naivety that it was over and that we were coming out of this terrible pandemic. So I wanted to end it on a very positive note, and I thought a very lovely thing which was announced in late August internationally was the World Health Organization's statement that wild polio, myelitis polio, had been eradicated from the continent of Africa. And so I did a page with bunting and a sort of style of what forgive me if they're not right, but a style of sort of African type textiles and bunting because of the festive nature of it. And so it was meant to be a jubilant end to my book. But I did this image at the end, this single head, because actually, of course we didn't know that at the time, I put that in later. Because the events of into early autumn 2020 weren't the way we wanted them to go and the numbers were going up again, I felt by then, having done the first book, it was very incomplete, and to end on an optimistic note, which is what the first book did, was misplaced, really. I'm interested in hand axes in the sense that I'm very interested in archaeology, and they do represent an extraordinary development in our evolution to do with the opportunities that they would then give us. So I was exploring these lovely different shapes of these beautiful pieces of stone which are carved in a much more sophisticated way than they might first appear. And here we have, in amongst all these hand axes, which are all very differently faceted and, and napped, if you like, there's the one here which very much to do with the American elections, which were on the 3rd of November in 2020. We have a second lockdown, and it started on the 5th of November, and of course we were thinking about Christmas then, and we're thinking everybody was getting a little bit weary then, and these pages are about, again, referring back to our histories, to these stone structures which I'm very interested in called tors and dolmen, some of them natural, some of them man-made. I think there's an awful lot about our shared histories throughout these books. I'm going through these quite quickly, but they're all again to do with land forms and creeping up towards Christmas. On the 6th of January, not only did we go into another lockdown, but Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. This is my double page that I did about it. One could say that Capitol Hill is sort of the symbol of democracy. That's arguable, I'm sure, but I suddenly looked at it and thought it looked like the top of it looked like an egg, and how fragile that egg actually suddenly became. So in this one, there's the edge of a yolk and an egg spilling out the side of it, because suddenly it seemed very unstable. Another lockdown on January the 6th, which was the same day as the Capitol Hill storming. And again, this bewilderment, things going on way longer than we'd ever imagined. And just a double page of a sort of frozen, bewildered sense about everyone. And there'd been so much talk in the United States about a wall built by Trump to keep Mexicans out. And of course then the whole idea of barriers and walls and keep boundaries have been so evident in all the migrations and people attempting to come to Britain and to come to Europe, particularly from Syria, in its absolute crisis. And of course the thing that's not spoken about so much is that when you wall people out, you wall yourself in. So this image here is when it says locked down, locked out, locked in. And it's the idea that we lock ourselves apart, and we all suffer from that. More to do with prehistoric sites and stones and megaliths and their true meaning and what they are, and how do we interpret them so out of time. This one is about the children, and of course in the middle of all these lockdowns, the children and the young people were in the heart of this. They were the least likely to get the virus, and arguably some of the group probably most likely to be affected by being locked down from each other and not going to school, having to learn online at home. And on the 8th of March 2021, they went back again. They went back to school again, and it must have been traumatic for a lot of them to be alienated from each other for so long, and then to have to relearn to socialise again. And I did some things to do with my garden, to do with the topiary that I cut when in my garden. This was a very significant day, the 23rd March last year, 21st, 2021. A year on, and a year on, 120 in the UK, 126,284 dead, and of course I didn't know the figure for long COVID. More figures, particularly female forms from sort of very simplified forms, Egyptian, me having been jabbed. I've had both my vaccines by then, so there's a picture of a female body I've been jabbed twice now. This is all about Afghanistan. And the reason I've chosen lapis lazuli, because some of the best fields in the world for lapis lazuli are in these remote parts of Afghanistan, and they have been for quite a long time under the control of the warlords and the Taliban. And we're coming to the end of this second book now, and I realised by July that this, with the new variants that were coming in from COVID, that the landscape had changed enormously from the first book, which was one of optimism. This book finishes on a much more sort of salutary and accepting but weary note. And this is the final double page, is simply a page of heads, whether they're human or animal. So that finishes the book, and it includes animals, of course, all looking out in a relatively sorrowful way, I guess.